The man known to history as King George I was born on the 28th of May 1660 in the city of Hanover in north-central Germany in what was then the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg. His father was Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg. He would acquire further titles in subsequent years, notably that of Prince Bishop of Osnabrück, and, most importantly, the Prince Elector of Hanover, which he was awarded in 1692, a title of considerable importance within the Holy Roman Empire. George's mother was Sophia of the Palatinate, a large principality which controlled much of western Germany along the course of the River Rhine. She had familial ties to many of Europe's most prominent ruling families, notably in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Her marriage to Ernest Augustus in 1658 was a political one and brought further ties to lineages such as the Danish royal family that Ernest Augustus was related to. George was their first child. 6 more would follow, 5 more boys and 1 daughter named Sophia Charlotte, who would become Queen of Prussia through marriage one day. Of the boys, the younger sons would take up military careers, given that they were never realistically in line to succeed to the Hanoverian titles, though George would have a rivalry of sorts with the next oldest son, Frederick Augustus. Frederick was born in 1661, and there was a good possibility throughout much of his life that he would succeed to some of the Hanoverian lands, as the principle of primogeniture, whereby the firstborn son or daughter, where no sons were available, would succeed to the entirety of the family estate, was not legally established yet in Hanover by the second half of the 17th century, a legacy of the medieval era when dominions were often divided between several sons. The succession politics of Hanover were not the only complication at the time of George's birth. Germany in those days was a confusing patchwork of political entities. Back in the High Middle Ages and late medieval period, Germany had been divided into literally hundreds of different political entities, some being large duchies, margraviates, principalities and counties, others being small free cities and territories, while many bishops and other ecclesiastical lords also ruled small states themselves. All of these were loosely confederated under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, with an emperor elected by 7 electors from amongst the most powerful German states, though the imperial office by the 17th century was virtually a hereditary title for the Austrian House of Habsburg. A process of centralization had been underway in the 16th and 17th centuries, with many of the smaller states being absorbed by their larger neighbors, but even so, there were still well over 100 German states by the time George was born. The Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg was one of the larger ones. Thus, George was born into a family of substantial political power in 17th century Germany. To make matters even more confusing, some of these states were Lutheran Protestant, some were Roman Catholic, and others still adhered to the Reformed or Calvinist branch of Protestantism. These religious divisions had led to a century and a half of political tension in Central Europe following the Protestant Reformation, and when George was born in 1660, the Holy Roman Empire was still recovering from the 30 Years' War, which, between 1618 and 1648, had led to devastation across Germany as the Austrian Habsburgs tried, unsuccessfully, to enforce Catholicism across Central Europe. George's childhood was a relatively happy one by all accounts. His mother doted on him and his siblings to a degree uncommon amongst the upper aristocracy at that time. He was evidently not his parents' favourite, but he was viewed as a good eldest child, one who was conscientious, sober, and responsible from a young age, necessary qualities in a political heir. He received an education from the governor and receptor of the household until his 15th year in 1675, learning to speak and write in German, French, and Latin. His main interests early on, however, lay in hunting and riding, and he and his father bonded over these activities. That same year of 1675, when his formal education ended, he also began his career as a military officer, campaigning with his father against the French and allied with the Dutch in the Franco-Dutch War. George was present at the Battle of Saarbrücken late that summer and took part in several more campaigns in 1676 and 1677. In 1679, he was afforded the title of Duke of Hanover, a sign of his position as senior heir to his father. With this title, he was sent to England in 1680 to visit the court of King Charles II there and to spend some time at Oxford, where he was given an honorary degree. It remains a matter of debate as to whether or not marriage negotiations were tentatively entered into for George to marry King Charles's niece, Anne. In any event, they resulted in nothing if they were. Back in Germany after his English trip, an arrangement was worked out whereby George would marry his first cousin, his uncle, Georg William's daughter, Sophia Dorothea. This union was arrived at as a means of preventing the splitting up of the family lands and to solidify George's future financial situation by uniting Hanover with the Celle lands that his uncle controlled. It was hardly an ideal basis for marriage and would end in tragedy for her years later. In the short term, it resulted in children after they married in November 1682, George being 22 years of age and his bride just 16. A boy named George Ludwig was born almost exactly a year after the marriage. The second and last child, a girl named Sophia Dorothea, after her mother, was born 4 years later in 1687. Many years later, she would marry Prince Frederick William I of Prussia, a marriage from which came a child named Frederick, who became Frederick II. Thus, George was the grandfather of the Prussian ruler who became known as Frederick the Great, the man who was responsible for Prussia's emergence as a great European power in the 18th century. Not long after he married Sophia Dorothea, George was involved in one of the most seismic events in early modern European history, though one that is largely forgotten about today. For 300 years since the late 14th century, the Ottoman Turks had been expanding their control over the Balkans, while their empire eventually grew to include the Levant and most of North Africa as well, meaning that Ottoman fleets controlled much of the Mediterranean Sea. Since the 1520s, they had controlled most of Hungary and other parts of the Carpathian Basin. Now, in 1683, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman government, Kara Mustafa Pasha, attempted to capture the city of Vienna from the Austrian Habsburgs and laid siege to the Austrian capital with an army of 150,000 men. The city was comparatively underdefended and would surely have fallen to the Turks had a grand alliance of Christian states of Central Europe not been formed by John III Sobieski, King of Poland, and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Hanover contributed to the relief effort, and George headed along to campaign to Vienna, fighting in the Great Battle of Vienna on the 12th of September 1683, a clash which resulted in Christian victory and stopped an Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The brothers continued to campaign against the Turks periodically in the years that followed, as an alliance of Christian states in Central Europe became determined to push the Ottoman Empire back and ensure it never posed a threat to Vienna again. Eventually, in 1791, George's brother Frederick would be killed while campaigning. By then, though, the possibility that George and he would split the Hanoverian dominions between them was gone. Much to Frederick's frustration, in the mid-1680s, their father had decreed that henceforth Hanover would follow the principle of primogeniture and that all of his lands would consequently pass to George upon his death, provided his eldest son was still alive at that time. It was a very belated decision in Europe, where virtually every other major power had adopted primogeniture centuries earlier. Not long after Frederick's death, the political importance of the state George would one day inherit increased sizably. Since the mid-14th century, there had typically been 7 prince-electors within the Holy Roman Empire that elected the Holy Roman Emperor whenever that office fell vacant. These were the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the Prince Archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. During the 30 Years' War, the Count Palatine of the Rhine had been replaced briefly by the Duke of Bavaria as a reward for Duke Maximilian I's loyalty to the Austrian Habsburgs. When the war ended, the Count Palatine was readmitted, increasing the number of electors to 8. This created a voting problem, as an even number of electors could become deadlocked with equal votes for 2 different candidates. There were growing calls thereafter for a 9th elector to be added, ones which became even more vocal from 1685 onwards, after Philip William of Neuburg became Count Palatine of the Rhine. Philip William was a Catholic, and his accession threw the religious balance of the Electoral College out of order. Thus, in 1692, George's father was admitted as the 9th Prince-Elector, officially known as the Elector of Hanover. George would inherit this title one day and was now clearly one of the foremost political heirs of Central Europe. By the time George's father was elevated to the position of Elector of Hanover, a controversy was brewing at the Hanoverian court. George and his wife's marriage had never been close, but it had become even more strained in the second half of the 1680s as he spent more and more time absent from Hanover, campaigning against the Turks and on other duties. By the early 1690s, their indifference towards each other had turned into contempt, and George took a mistress by the name of Erengard Melusina von der Schulenburg in 1691. They would eventually have 3 illegitimate daughters together, the first born in January 1692. Sophia responded in kind, and in 1692 she began an affair with Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish noble and military officer in the Hanoverian army. They were not discreet in this, and by 1694 the affair had begun to cause such a controversy at the Hanoverian court that a group of courtiers murdered von Königsmarck that summer. George was not involved in the act, although he possibly knew that it was being planned. Several months later, George and Sophia's marriage was dissolved as Sophia refused to cohabit with George following the murder of her lover. She was sent thereafter to what amounted to a house imprisonment at Alden House in Lüneburg, and would spend the next 3 decades there down to her death in 1726. A harsh fate, yet she did little to improve her situation by becoming a focus of conspiracies within the Hanoverian dominions for years to come. George would continue his relationship with Melusina for the remainder of his life, but they never married, and he also had other mistresses at various junctures. While George was in his late 20s, developments which might have seemed unrelated to him were occurring several hundred kilometers to the west of Hanover in England, events that would have profound bearing on his later life and those of his descendants. In 1685, King Charles II of England, Scotland and Ireland had died without a legitimate heir, despite siring over a dozen illegitimate children. He was succeeded by his brother, James, Duke of York. The accession of King James II was very problematic, as he was a Roman Catholic in a country which had become staunchly Protestant over the previous century and a half. It wasn't long before his heavy-handed manner of governing and his religion led to a coup, and in 1688 the Glorious Revolution occurred. Through this, James was deposed in favour of his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. Mary II and William III did not have any children, and so following Mary's death in 1694 and William's in 1702, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Queen Anne I. Anne's accession did not hold out the prospect of a simple line of succession either. Though having numerous children and being pregnant 14 times at least, Anne had a brutal natal history, and virtually all of her children had been lost during pregnancy or died before reaching their second birthday. In the summer of 1700, her only remaining child, 11-year-old Prince William, died. There was now no clear successor to Anne in the eyes of England's Protestants, who refused to countenance the possibility of old King James's Catholic son, who lived in exile in France, succeeding Anne one day. All of this had implications for George, as the House of Hanover was related to the English royal house of Stuart. George was the great-grandson of King James I, who had ruled England between 1603 and 1625. James had a daughter named Elizabeth, who, in 1613, had married Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, who ruled over a large German principality along the River Rhine. One of their children, born in the autumn of 1630, was none other than George's mother, Sophia. As such, George had a claim to the English throne, one which was further solidified in 1701 when the English Parliament passed an Act of Settlement that legally prohibited any Roman Catholic from succeeding to the throne of England, a measure designed to block the Catholic branch of the House of Stuart from resuming the throne once Anne died. With this, it became clear that George might be the most likely successor to Anne. There was precedent for a foreigner succeeding to the English throne in this way. After all, George's great-grandfather, King James I, was a Scotsman who had succeeded to the English throne back in 1603 by right of being the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty back in 1485. George's father died in late January 1698. With that, George ascended as Prince Elector of Hanover at 37 years of age, and with the associated titles of Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg and Prince Bishop of Osnabrück. Over the next decade and a half, much of his focus would be on the War of the Spanish Succession, through which a grand alliance with Britain, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and smaller German states, such as Hanover, sought to prevent a member of the French royal family from succeeding to the Spanish throne following the extinction of the direct Habsburg royal line there in 1700 when King Charles II died. Hanover was one of the more minor players in the war, which was waged from 1701 down to 1714, though still an important partner of the British, fighting against some of the pro-French German states such as Bavaria and Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Throughout it, George was an active war leader, campaigning himself in person during most campaigns. His qualities as a general were considerable, and in 1707 he was offered the position of Imperial Field Marshal within the Holy Roman Empire. In the end, Hanover was one of the few states that emerged well out of the war after sheer exhaustion led to peace treaties being signed in 1713 and 1714, with its position as the 9th Elector of the Holy Roman Empire acknowledged by all parties, and some lands gained at the expense of its smaller neighbours like Wolfenbüttel. Another of the main issues which would come to concern George in his time as Elector of Hanover was the Great Northern War. In the 16th century, numerous powers had emerged in northern and eastern Europe that became rivals for dominance of the Baltic Sea and the Baltic States region around modern-day Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. The three main players were the Kingdom of Sweden, Tsarist Russia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the dual monarchy of Denmark-Norway also playing a part, and some of the smaller North German states being dragged into the conflicts occasionally. Wars had periodically occurred. They were all eclipsed, though, by the clash which broke out in 1700. The Great Northern War was launched by Peter the Great of Russia in an effort to end Sweden's dominance of the Baltic Sea and to acquire a Baltic Sea port for Russia, the region around modern-day St. Petersburg being controlled by Sweden in those times. Russia found allies in Warsaw and Copenhagen amongst the Poles, Lithuanians, and Danes, while numerous other powers would be pulled in from time to time from around Europe in a clash that would last 21 years. George was always sympathetic towards the Russian cause. In appraising this position, one needs to consider that Sweden in the 17th century had taken control of much of the Baltic coastline of northern Germany around Mecklenburg eastwards into Pomerania. With Hanover's lands lying just to the south, anything which weakened the Swedes could potentially be in Hanover's interests. Consequently, George informally allied himself with Russia, the Poles, and the Danes, though he did not enter the war for many years. Indeed, Russian victory at the Battle of Poltava in 1709 seemed to have brought the war to an end in Swedish defeat, but in 1715, King Charles XII of Sweden returned home after years in exile and reignited the conflict. At this juncture, George decided to enter the war fully on the side of Russia and Peter the Great's other allies, hoping to gain land in the eventual peace negotiations. In the years that followed, George contributed tens of thousands of troops towards the war in northern Europe, as Charles XII tried to re-establish Swedish dominance over the Baltic and to conquer Norway from the Danes. His death at the siege of Fredriksten in November 1718 ended matters for the most part, and the new Swedish government quickly sought to bring the Great Northern War to an end. George benefited immensely from the difficult position the Swedes were in, and through the Treaty of Stockholm, signed in November 1719, his negotiators secured the duchies of Bremen and Verden in northern Germany as the spoils of war. For all of the time that Hanoverian troops were fighting the Swedish, George was directing their activities from England rather than Germany. On the 1st of August 1714, George's cousin, Queen Anne, died. Her death came 8 weeks after that of George's own mother, Sophia, at 83 years of age. Hence, the way was cleared for George to succeed Anne as King of Britain and Ireland. Extensive measures had been put in place before Anne ever died to prepare for the succession of the House of Hanover and to avoid the Catholic son of the deposed King James II in France from trying to pursue his claim to the throne. Thus, in an age before telecommunications of any kind, George had already been proclaimed as the King of Britain and Ireland in London long before he even knew that Anne was dead. It would be days before he learned of the events, and then it took several weeks for the preparations to be made for him to travel to England and to enter London as the new monarch. Subtle signs of his accession were seen in the royal documentation which was associated with the succession. The new king signing documents with the anglicised version of his name, George, with an E, rather than the German Georg, without an E, within days of ascending to the throne. George landed at Greenwich near London on the 18th of September 1714 with a large party of German nobles and courtiers, including his mistress and his children. 2 days later, the royal party entered London around midday, the procession proceeding slowly through the capital over a course of several hours, so that the over 500,000 inhabitants of the city had a chance to see their new monarch in an age when the physical presence of the king and his image on coins were the only real mechanisms for projecting royal power into the public domain. All told, it was a fairly seamless succession, given the variables involved and the threat of the plans being destabilized in a country where many people were distinctly unhappy with the idea of a German dynasty ascending as the royal family, no matter their relation to the House of Stuart. Matters were not helped by the fact that George arrived in England unable to speak the language of his subjects, although he could converse in French with many people in government and with the nobility, as this was the lingua franca of European court society in the 17th and 18th centuries. Nevertheless, it was not a good look for a man who was either fully or partially proficient in German, French, Latin, Dutch, and Italian to have not bothered to begin learning English years earlier in expectation of becoming King of Britain. While the Hanoverian succession had been effected with few problems in London when George and his court arrived there in September, the signs of discontent were more tangible elsewhere. Riots and public disorder offences rose in the weeks that followed George's arrival in England in cities and towns across the country, peaking on the 20th of October, the day of the new king's coronation at Westminster, a service which was normally carried out in English, but which was celebrated in Latin so that George and his courtiers from Germany could understand what was being said. As undesirable as the riots were, they paled in significance to what occurred north of the border in Scotland. Tensions were still running high in Scotland in 1714 as a result of the 1707 Act of Union, which had joined the monarchies of England and Scotland into the new entity of Great Britain and had brought the Scottish Parliament to an end as well. In the months following the accession, many nobles there, led by the Earl of Mar, began plotting to restore the House of Stuart by declaring their support for James II's son, James Edward Stuart. In August 1715, they launched a short-lived rebellion in the Scottish Highlands. It proved relatively easy to suppress it by the end of the year, though corresponding revolts had been planned in Scotland and in parts of England around Bristol and along the southern ports. Had the Jacobite uprising been better planned, and had the Dutch not sent thousands of troops to Britain on short notice to honour the terms of a treaty signed with the English government in Anne's time, through which they had promised to aid in ensuring that George ascended to the throne smoothly, things could have played out very differently. As it was, George's regime survived this initial scare quite easily. The political system in the country George had arrived to rule was substantially different to what he was used to in Hanover. Hanover was still an autocratic principality where the elector prince ruled in association with ministers and bureaucrats that he selected personally. Britain, by way of contrast, was already well along the way to becoming a fully fledged modern constitutional monarchy. The civil wars of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had reduced the power of the monarchy and strengthened Parliament, the latter of which was a nearly permanently sitting body that governed the nation and its affairs. The senior officers of state, however, were still picked by the monarch rather than being elected, though they had to command some parliamentary support to remain in office. While nearly all of these constitutional changes had occurred during the Stuart era, George had his own place in British political history in being the monarch under whom the concept of a modern prime minister emerged. In the late 1710s, he came under increasing pressure from the parliamentary House of Commons to appoint Robert Walpole, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as head of the administration. George was not initially favourable to the idea. Nevertheless, following a financial crisis in 1720, he eventually capitulated and Walpole became the de facto Prime Minister of Britain in 1721. He would hold that office for the next 21 years until 1742, becoming the longest-serving Prime Minister in British history, as well as the first. While Walpole did dominate the government from 1721 onwards, George was not averse to playing some role in British political affairs. He had demonstrated this in 1717 when he pushed for the agreement known as the Triple Alliance. This was agreed between Britain, the Dutch Republic, and France, and was a major reorientation of European politics. For decades since the Franco-Dutch War broke out in 1672, England and the Dutch had generally been in conflict with France. The death of King Louis XIV in 1715 opened the way for realignment in such a way that would prevent the near-constant state of war that had existed between 1672 and 1714, with the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession having mired Western and Central Europe in conflict for 28 of those 42 years. The alliance was also formed as a means of signalling to Spain, which felt betrayed by the losses it had sustained at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, not to seek a new war with the hope of French aid. The Triple Alliance of 1717 was more of a non-aggression pact than a full military alliance, but it was effective all the same. In contrast to his time as Elector of Hanover, George's reign as King of Great Britain was markedly peaceful, with no major wars enveloping Europe again until the War of the Austrian Succession broke out in 1740. There were other issues which arose during the reign between George and some political groupings in England. One concerned religion and his attitude towards the Church of England. George was a Lutheran, a moderate Protestant. On the surface, this posed little problem, but England had a complicated religious landscape in which Protestants were not simply opposed to Catholics. There were both moderate and radical forms of Protestantism, Anglicans, who conformed to the Church of England being the more moderate wing, while others were favourers of Calvinism, or Puritanism as it is termed in England. Both sides feared that George would prove either too moderate or too radical. In the end, he outflanked both sides by steering a via media, favouring a politique approach to religion, the primary goal of which was avoiding religious controversy of all kinds. Catholicism was the enemy in George's eyes, and so he sought to dampen religious tensions amongst Protestants. Elsewhere, when it came to Parliament, George was forced to make concessions in the form of the Peerage Bill of 1719, a piece of legislation which was introduced to halt the creation of new peers or nobles out of a general concern that too many Germans were being awarded British noble titles following the Hanoverian succession. The Peerage Bill was as much directed against the Prince of Wales as it was against the King himself. George's son, the future King George II, was a forceful figure who tried to play a role in British political life in the first years of his father's reign in Britain. This soon led to conflict between father and son in a relationship which had always been strained. Matters came to a head in 1717 over the arrangements for the baptizing of the Prince of Wales's son, George's grandson, Prince George William. The ceremony descended into an argument between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Newcastle, leading to a challenge of a duel. Annoyed by this public display of impetuosity by his son, a rift ensued between king and prince, one that dragged on well into 1718. They were eventually reconciled to some extent, but the relationship between George and his heir was always a strained one. It is difficult to get a sense of who the man that was managing this transition in British government was. Historians have tended to view George as one of the most elusive and secretive of all the country's monarchs. There were contradictions. For instance, his correspondence with his daughter, Sophia Dorothea, indicates a loving parent. On the other hand, his treatment of his wife, Sophia's mother, was abysmal. The same contradictions existed when it came to his role as monarch. His failure to learn to speak English in advance of Anne's death, along with the sporadic manner in which he picked up some of the language thereafter, seems to indicate a lack of interest in what his British subjects thought of him. At the same time, however, there is evidence that when he did begin to learn more English in the 1720s, it was for the purposes of discerning how he was being written about in the English newspapers. He was socially awkward and never became comfortable in his position as head of a large royal court, yet in more relaxed environments behind closed doors with friends, he could be strikingly informal for a monarch, favouring bawdy jokes and being quite self-deprecating. One thing is for sure, he was not, as some earlier generations of historians made out, an unintelligent man. No ruler that was dim could have managed the Hanoverian succession as successfully as he did. Although he was not naturally inclined to be a sociable figure, George attempted to make himself a more publicly visible ruler in England than he had been in Hanover, the better to foster a closer relationship with his new subjects and offset the chances of any further revolts, such as those which had already marked the first year of his reign. A notable element of this was his public feasts that he held at one of the more prominent royal residences of the 18th century, Hampton Court. During the summers, he would invite dozens of guests to these feasts, held on the grounds of this location, while more still would be invited to attend the gardens there, where George would progress in the evenings, meeting his subjects and hearing their petitions. Through these interactions and his own efforts, he slowly began to learn English. How fluent he became has been debated, but there are government documents from the 1720s, years after he arrived in England, which demonstrate that he was able to read English to a certain extent by that time. He also presided over regular hunting trips to which members of England's nobility and political and economic communities were invited. Spending on his court was high and was geared towards winning over the political classes in England, cementing the status of the Hanoverian dynasty as the new royal family. It must be said that George's court did not offer patronage to many great thinkers. This, though, was something of an accidental happenstance of the times. It simply so happened that numerous prominent academics and artistic figures within British society had either died or were at the twilight of their lives when George came to the throne. John Locke, the great philosopher and essayist, had died in 1704. Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect who oversaw the reconstruction of London following the Great Fire of 1666, was still alive, though his foremost accomplishments were behind him when George came to England, and Wren died in 1723. Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics and one of the most accomplished scientists in human history, was kept on as Master of the Royal Mint by George, though he was already in his 70s at the time of the Hanoverian succession, and his most pioneering work lay behind him. Others, such as the poet Alexander Pope, who were in the full prime of their career, were satirists of the royal court. While there was no Wren, Locke, or Newton in their full brilliance for George to patronize, he did support the London theatres in the cultural sphere, with the Haymarket Theatre opening its doors in the capital in 1720. The king frequented the London theatres when productions of French plays by the likes of Molière, Corneille, and Racine were being staged, his limited grasp of English reducing the degree to which he favoured English playwrights. If there was one brilliant cultural figure associated with George's court in England, it was surely the composer George Frederick Handel. Born in Halle in Germany in 1685, Handel had learnt his craft in Germany and Italy before relocating to London in 1712 on an invitation from Charles Montague, the first Duke of Manchester. He was still there when George succeeded to the throne in 1714, a fortuitous succession as Handel had briefly served as Kapellmeister, or Master of the Choir, in Hanover in 1710 in George's employ as Elector of Hanover. Over the next 30 years, he would compose an enormous array of operas and librettos in England, emerging as arguably the greatest England-based composer of the Baroque and classical eras of Western music, and the only figure associated with the Hanoverian court that could compare with composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart on the continent in the 18th century. George patronized some of Handel's work, and many of his operas premiered at the King's Theatre in London during the 1720s. Surely one of George's most significant, though underrated accomplishments, was the manner in which he furthered the expansion of Britain's burgeoning empire. When he came to the throne, England had already settled colonies in many regions. By then, The initial English colonies that had been founded in Virginia and New England in the early 17th century had been expanded through the granting of new charters to would-be colonists and war with the Dutch to secure New Netherland, which was seized and renamed New York, resulting in an unbroken string of colonies stretching from New Hampshire in the north south to the Carolinas. In the Caribbean, there were numerous prosperous sugar plantation colonies on islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and smaller enclaves like St. Kitts and Nevis. Elsewhere, while England only had a few coastal toeholds in India, its commercial activities here were expanding under the aegis of the English East India Company. This was a significant base to commence from. George's reign saw a modest but important expansion of this colonial activity. One notable element of this, which still impacts on the geography and administration of the United States 3 centuries later, was the establishment of a new colony in the region lying south of the Carolinas and north of the Spanish presence in Florida. Colonists had begun settling here to avoid the jurisdiction of either the Carolina or Virginia colonial governments in the late 17th century, but the expansion into the area accelerated in the 1710s and 1720s. George's government encouraged and began preparing to establish a new proprietorial colony there, though it would be a few years after his death that this was finalized. It was named Georgia and would go on to become the modern-day U.S. state that bears the same name. Elsewhere, a British colony on the island of Newfoundland in what is now eastern Canada that had been established during the latter stages of Queen Anne's reign was expanded by George's government, while in the Caribbean, the Bahamas became a British Crown colony in the 1720s after George's government had engaged in an extensive campaign to suppress the pirates operating here in the second half of the 1710s. In other respects, George's reign set more nefarious precedents. The 1710s and 1720s saw a considerable increase in Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, and the king himself benefited hugely from this trade. George's profits from the slave trade accrued primarily from his position as governor of the South Sea Company, a joint stock company which had been established in 1711 with the goal of reducing the national debt after years of involvement in the War of the Spanish Succession by undertaking new trading voyages to the South Seas, the early modern term for the South Pacific, an area which, unlike the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean, was still relatively underexplored and underexploited by the European powers in the 18th century. With the war coming to an end as George I took the throne, and with a new monopoly on slave trading between Africa and certain South American ports within Spain's empire as a concession of the peace talks, speculative investment poured into the South Sea Company. There had been economic bubbles already in the history of nascent European capitalism, notably the tulip mania in the Dutch Republic back in the 1630s, but this was the first instance of this on such a scale in England. Although it was a newly formed company and had realized no profits of any kind, when shares in the South Sea Company were floated in London in the late 1710s, a frenzy to acquire them began. The resulting bubble was exacerbated by the board members who exaggerated the scale of the perceived profits to be made. As a consequence, between late 1719 and May 1720, the price of shares rocketed up from just over £100 to £600, eventually reaching nearly £1,000 per share for a few days that summer. Then it all burst, and in the course of 1721, shares fell back to below £100. The South Sea Company did not go bust and would function as a valuable joint stock company until the mid-19th century, exploiting things like the whaling industry in the South Atlantic, but the South Sea bubble of 1720 ruined the personal finances of many individuals. Incredibly, even before the bubble burst, George's government had already passed the Bubble Act in June 1720, one which sought to prevent further economic bubbles of the kind that was still underway. Bizarrely, even as the government was legislating against it, speculators continued to invest in the bubble. Beyond these colonial ventures, George's reign saw a reaffirmation of what is often termed the blue water policy in Britain's imperial history. This was an unwritten rule of English foreign and military policy to promote the Royal Navy as the best means of extending Britain's empire abroad and protecting Britain against all enemies at home in Europe. A policy of this kind could be said to have been initiated as far back as the reign of Elizabeth I in the second half of the 16th century, but successive reigns saw it reaffirmed, notably through the professionalization of the Royal Navy in the 17th century. The Hanoverians, beginning with George I, gave fresh impetus to this, and over the course of the next century and a half, Britain would emerge as the preeminent global superpower based almost entirely on the strength of its navy and dominance of the world's seas. That process was already very much underway during George's reign. The manner in which British naval power was employed in the 1720s to curb efforts by Spain to retake Gibraltar and Minorca, which it had lost during the War of the Spanish Succession, underscored the manner in which effective British sea power would be the cornerstone of a successful foreign policy going forward in the 18th century. One part of Britain's empire, the one that was closest to home, was a perpetual problem, and in George's reign this was no different. This was Ireland. The country had been partially conquered in the 12th and 13th centuries, then fully conquered in the 16th. But there had been major revolts there in the 1590s, the 1640s, and the late 1680s, all with the goal of re-establishing the paramount position of the Roman Catholic majority. All of these rebellions had been defeated and had led to a growing Protestant ascendancy in which English, Welsh, and Scottish nobles and landlords controlled over 80% of the land, despite only constituting about 15% of the population. Even this Protestant elite were problematic in the eyes of the administrators in London, and in the 1710s a scandal had arisen whereby the Irish House of Lords had intervened in the management of the Irish courts. This was viewed as a step too far towards legislative and judicial independence in England, and in 1719 George's government oversaw the passage of the Declaratory Act. Given the royal assent by the king in 1720, it effectively subordinated the Irish Parliament to the English Parliament and was an important step in the eventual disestablishment of the Irish Parliament in 1800 through the Act of Union, whereby the Irish Parliament was dispensed with altogether, and henceforth Irish politicians had to take their seats in the English Parliament at Westminster. Measures like these, which were given George's imprimatur, did not go unopposed in Ireland. One of the most vocal critics of the policies of the early Hanoverian government was Jonathan Swift. Swift was an Anglo-Irish satirist and writer who also served as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. His reputation was already established by the time George ascended to the throne in England in 1714, but it was during George's reign that he wrote many of his most famous works, most of which were veiled critiques of Crown policy in Ireland. Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, is the most well-known, but the text which most directly attacked the king and his government was the Drapier's Letters. These were a series of 7 pamphlets published in 1724 and 1725 in response to the granting of a license to produce copper coins in Ireland to William Wood, an ironmonger and manufacturer. The license was highly unorthodox and was only granted to Wood in 1722 because he had paid a huge £10,000 bribe to George's long-term mistress and the mother of his younger children, Melusine von der Schulenburg. In attacking Wood and the manner in which he had received his license to mint coins by bribing the royal mistress, Swift was taking a major risk, and the texts were published pseudonymously under the name M.B. Drapier, though it was widely known that Swift was the author. Swift only became more audacious in his satire, and towards the end of George's reign, he began working on what would eventually be published in 1729 as a modest proposal for preventing the children of poor people from being a burthen to their parents or country, a scathing attack on English attitudes towards poor Irish Catholics, in which he satirically proposed that children should be sold as food to the rich in order to disburden the Hanoverian state of the cost of providing them with charity. To add to the many overseas realms that George had to manage, he still had the government of Hanover to oversee. Unlike Britain, Ireland, and the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean, the German lands remained directly under George's control and were not subject to oversight by the British Parliament or George's ministers in England. Although he lived for most of his life after 1714 in England, George returned to Germany periodically, visiting in 1716, 1719, 1723, and again in 1725, the latter visit carrying on into early 1726. In total, he spent approximately 2.5 years in Hanover between 1714 and 1727. During one of these visits, he finalized the Treaty of Charlottenburg, through which an alliance was formalized between Britain, Prussia, and the Electorate of Hanover, though many of the terms outlined in it, including marriage alliances that would involve George's children and grandchildren, were never followed through on. The episode is indicative of the international diplomacy which generally ensued when George visited Hanover, though the day-to-day governance of his German dominions was placed in the hands of administrators such as Andreas Gottlieb von Bernstorff and Hans Caspar von Bottmer, whom George trusted implicitly to run affairs in his absence. More generally, George was at his happiest in these years when visiting home, and the role of being King of Britain and Ireland was evidently a burden on him rather than a sought-after desire. George's final years were ones of increasing retirement. He allowed Walpole to continue running the government and stepped back even further from day-to-day administration. The few acts which he did engage in were symptomatic of this. For instance, George is generally credited with creating the Order of the Bath, one of Britain's highest chivalric honour classes, in 1725, junior today only to the Order of the Garter and the Order of the Thistle. But the new honour was really Walpole's design, as he developed a new honour which he could use to reward his own allies and it became a form of patronage offered by him as Prime Minister rather than by the king as monarch. Elsewhere, the Treaty of Charlottenburg was followed by the Treaty of Hanover in 1725, through which Britain, Hanover, Prussia and France allied with one another in response to the signing of the Treaty of Vienna months earlier, which had seen Austria and Spain draw closer to one another. The effects of this were considerable. For decades, Britain had been closely aligned with Austria, but George's reign saw this alliance ended and a reorientation to draw closer to Prussia, the emerging German power. Beyond such concerns, George spent much of his later years engaging with his growing brood of grandchildren. An interesting side note is that in the second half of 1726, he offered a home in exile to a young Voltaire, the future giant of the French Enlightenment, having had to absent himself from France after getting into an argument with the powerful Duc de Rohan. It was in England that Voltaire came into contact with an environment of liberality that he later claimed shaped his work for decades to come after he returned to France. George was in his mid-60s by the summer of 1727 when he determined to visit Hanover again, having been in England for nearly a year and a half. He had made it across the Channel and was travelling through the Dutch Republic when he became ill in mid-June. As the royal entourage stopped that evening, he complained of stomach cramps and chest pains, something which he initially attributed to indigestion from having consumed too much fruit the previous evening. Insisting that they continue on their way, with medical staff attending to him in his carriage, George suffered a stroke early in the morning of the 9th of June. The party rushed to the city of Osnabrück, where George died 2 days later on the 11th of June at 67 years of age. His remains were taken on to Hanover, and he was interred in the Leiner Schloss Palace in his homeland, though he was subsequently reburied at the Herrenhausen Gardens after the Second World War. George was the last reigning British monarch to be buried outside of England, and just one of 6 since the Norman Conquest to be so, the others being William the Conqueror, Henry II and Richard I in the 11th and 12th centuries, James II in France as a result of his being deposed in 1688, and Philip II, who was buried in Spain, the realm he governed for decades in the 16th century after his wife, Mary Tudor, died in 1558. As such, George's burial in Germany was a very unusual development for an English monarch. George's reign in many ways laid the foundation for the massive expansion of the British Empire over the next century. During the reign of his son and successor, King George II, which lasted down to 1760, Britain's commercial and colonial interests grew, with the first array of large conquests in India in the mid-1750s, around the same time that Britain was displacing the French from Canada. Not long afterwards, James Cook would begin his expeditions to the South Seas, around which there had been so much speculative investment in George's time, exploring much of the Pacific Ocean and paving the way for British colonization of Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. By the time George's great-grandson, King George III, died in 1820, the sun rarely set on the British Empire, and Britain had emerged as the wealthiest nation in the world, the home of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. That this was possible was owing to the political stability at home in England which ensued from the Hanoverian succession. George I is a generally underappreciated British monarch. There are plenty of reasons why this is the case. Britain, for instance, did not fight in any major war during his reign, other than playing a small role in the Northern War, and he was a generally uncontroversial monarch. His reign was rather dull, in a sense, by comparison with the civil wars and political battles which characterized England's history in the 17th century, or indeed the much more colourful reign of his great-grandson George III, in whose time the American Revolutionary War was fought, the British Raj was formed, Britain led resistance to the French Empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Industrial Revolution began. But, in a way, what Britain needed in 1714, when George came to the throne, was a dull monarch, one who would oversee the Hanoverian succession without arousing too much animosity, and who allowed the British political, economic and colonial system to continue evolving in the way it had been for decades, resulting in a growing commercial system and a constitutional monarchy that was beginning to resemble a modern parliamentary democracy. George might not have been a great monarch, but he was an ideal monarch to establish the Hanoverian dynasty and put Britain on the path to becoming the world's preeminent superpower in the 19th century. What do you think of George I? Was he, in many ways, Britain's most underappreciated monarch who, in his own uncontroversial way, steadied the British ship of state during the Hanoverian succession, and then paved the way for Britain's rapid imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.